Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As the title, The Entangled State of God and Humanity, suggests, this webinar dispenses with the pre-Copernican, patriarchal, anthropomorphic image of God, while presenting a case for a third millennium theology, one illuminated by insights from archetypal depth psychology, quantum physics, neuroscience, and evolutionary biology. It attempts to smash the contrived conceptual boundaries between science and religion. The published work of C.G. Jung, physicist Wolfgang Pauli and David Bohm, and the Jesuit paleontologist Todd de Chardin outline a process whereby matter evolves in increasing complexity from subatomic particles to the human brain and the emergence of a reflective consciousness leading to a noosphere evolving towards an omega point. The noosphere is the envelope of consciousness and meaning superimposed on the biosphere, a concept absolutely central to the evolutionary thought of the Jesuit paleontologist Todd de Chardin, whose magnum opus was the phenomenon of man. Now, Teilhard's central ideas, like those of Jung with the archetypes, in particular that of the self, provide intimations of a numinous principle implicit in cosmology and the discovery that in and through humanity, evolution not only becomes conscious of itself, but also directed and purposive. Although, in Jung's conception, it was a late-born offspring of the unconscious soul, consciousness has become the mirror which the universe has evolved to reflect upon itself and in which its very existence is revealed. The implication for process theology is that God and humanity are in an entangled state, so that the evolution of God cannot be separated from that of humankind. A process, incarnational theology, inseminated by the theory of evolution, is one in which humankind completes the individuation of God towards the wholeness represented, for instance, in cosmic mandala symbols. Jung himself believed that God needs humankind to become conscious, whole, and complete, a thesis explored in my book, The Individuation of God, Integrating Science and Religion. Central to any attempt to reintegrate science and religion, which have been in a state of schism for 400 years, is understanding the nature of the psychophysical problem or the nature of the relationship between mind and matter. I shall be exploring that in great depth in this webinar, proposing that it's a relationship of complementarity. Archetypes as timeless, cosmic, ordering and regulating principles suggest concepts of mind which transcend the individual in a transpersonal sense. Dimensions of mind and of the self not strangled by the spatio-temporal whole, and a numinous dimension implicit in the evolutionary process, so that God and humanity are in an entangled state, resulting in a process, incarnational theology, exemplified perhaps best by that of Todd de Chardin, in which the numinous is both immanent and transcendent, corresponding to Jung's God archetype. Conservative and fundamentalist theologies, on the other hand, remain suspicious of science and mysticism while casting a Jungian shadow over humanity, as many atrocities rationalized in the name of religious ideology, but which represent an acting out of humanity's unconscious and destructive shadow qualities, simply amply attest. These conservative and fundamentalist theologies perpetuate the schism between science and religion which has existed since the 17th century, 400 years of it. The late high-energy physicist Kullervo Laurikainen, in his book Beyond the Atom, The Philosophical Thought of Wolfgang Pauli, has commented upon the contradictions that Newton noticed between the idea of absolute causality and religious concepts. Laurie Kanan wrote, and I quote, "Fiers has in particular presented the idea that it was the awareness of this contradiction which may have been the reason for the depression which Newton underwent sometime after publication of Principia. According to Pauli, it was in just this respect that the 17th century went too far." In what way, we might ask? Well, belief in the idea that God had created the world as able to be perfectly described mathematically produced as an outcome a world picture in which God simply no longer has any place. The inference was that reality could be completely described in materialistic terms, so that psyche or spirit was exorcised from science, and the role of the human observer could be ignored and banished from science, at least until the rise of the quantum and relativity revolutions in physics in the early 20th century and the synchronistic emergence of Jung's archetypal psychology and Freudian psychoanalysis. If we're going to talk about a reintegration of science and religion, it is important to come to some understanding of what the nature of that relationship might be. And as I have already intimated, that would be a relationship of complementarity. However, I shall be arguing that point. Physicist Wolfgang Pauli and depth psychologist Carl Jung collaborated between 1932 and 1958, Pauli having undergone a brief period of analysis with Jung for severe depression and alcoholism. Conjointly, they coined the term personal equation to refer to the role of the observer, whereas in Pauli's U field, the unconscious is the psychological counterpart of the field concept in quantum physics. Consciousness is a late-born offspring of the unconscious soul. Both Pauli and Jung viewed science and religion in a relationship of complementarity analogous to the wave-particle and other dualities in physics, upon which I shall be commenting later. While understanding the unconscious archetypes as verifiable in both our observations of the external world, expressed mathematically in empirical laws, and in the structure of the internal world of the psyche. Similarly, both mind and matter are complementary aspects of an original, primordial, unitary, and timeless reality, known as the unus mundus, or one world, which transcends space-time. The neuroscientist Carl Pribram has had a lot to say about that in a paper called Consciousness Reassessed, published in the Mind and Matter Journal in 2004. This unus mundus is analogous to Bohm's well-known implicate order of the cosmos, where active quantum information forms a bridge between mind and matter, as do the archetypes for Jung and Pauli. Metaphysics, understood in the sense of Jung and Pauli, refers to a reality more substantial, more material, as it were, than everything that physics and psychology would characterize as real. I've taken that quotation from an editorial written by Harold Appensparker in the Mind and Matter Journal, 2011, Volume 9. The term personal equation, as I've indicated, was coined in the relationship between Jung and Pauli in their collaboration. According to Pauli, and as noted by Laurie Kanan, and I quote, "The most important lesson that quantum mechanics has given us is that we must always include the observer in our picture of the world. We must always include the observer in our picture of the world. This was the original spirit in the Copenhagen philosophy, and exactly in this point, Pauli represents this philosophy in the most consistent way." Pauli regarded the anomaly of the personal equation of the observer as particularly troublesome because scientific theories, after all, were products of the psyche, with a great deal of unconscious preparation, as if in some kind of secret laboratory or beneath a veil. Pauli noted in his correspondence that in quantum experiments, the consciousness of the observer could no longer be ignored, and probably due to his collaboration with Carl Jung, as he wanted to enrich Jung's theory with insights from quantum physics, he concluded that repression of the psyche after the 17th century had been one-sided and dangerous, giving rise to a materialistic culture in which the influence of religion has continuously diminished, and of which a very strict separation between science and religion is characteristic, and I would add militantly perpetuated by the current crop of neo-atheists. Pauli shared Jung's notion of a reality besides the reality of an unconscious, besides external reality, which he expressed as a U field. In a letter to Marcus Fiers, his colleague, physicist Pauli wrote, and I quote, "Regarding the psychological analogy of the physical field concept, it seems to me to lie in the notion of the unconscious. For the unconscious posits a reality like the physical field, an invisible reality mediating a connection between spatially and maybe temporally distant visible phenomena. This seems to me," he wrote, "to express a much deeper similarity than only a superficial analogy." With regard to aspects of symbolic reality with which psyche and physis confront us, Pauli proposed that the notion of complementarity coined by his colleague Niels Bohr would serve as a guideline. Pauli wrote, "Real pairs of opposites, like particle versus wave, or position versus momentum, or energy versus time, exist in physics. One member of the pair can never be eliminated in favor of the other, but both are taken over into a new type of physical reality, which expresses properly the complementary character of the contrast." Here's the end of reductionism, materialist reductionism. A similar notion of complementarity, then, would characterize the relationship between mind and matter, psychology and physics, and science and religion. And I shall be arguing this point further, of course. Now, from a slightly different perspective, in his final work, The Undivided Universe, physicist David Bohm expressed the insight that active information served as the bridge between the mental and the physical. Bohm's concept of active quantum information acting as the bridge between mind and matter is remarkably similar and perhaps synchronous with the Jung-Pauli notion of the unconscious archetypes as cosmic ordering and regulating principles. These insights, I'm arguing, provide the basis for the complementarity of mind and matter. Bohm clearly adopted what is known technically as a dual-aspect monist notion of the mental and physical being complementary, though absolutely irreducible to one another, while rejecting reductionism of either an idealist or materialist nature. The conflation of emergent consciousness, that late-born offspring of the unconscious soul, with extended mind in the forms I've mentioned already, actually leads to the error of panpsychism. It's very important in considering extended mind in various contributions not to conflate it with that much later arrival in evolution known as reflected consciousness. Furthermore, metaphysics taken seriously in the sense of Pauli and Jung refers, as I have indicated, to a reality more substantial, more material, as it were, than everything that physics and psychology would characterize as real. This form of extraphysical, or dare I say metaphysical reality, was designated by a mode of cognition expressed through abstract symbols. A mode of cognition expressed through abstract symbols. Such a notion contrasts, of course, with the classical idea of metaphysical concepts as absolutely disreputable and to be passed over in silence because they were devoid of any scientific status in a classical mechanistic view of science prior to the quantum and relativity revolutions in physics and, of course, the emergence of depth psychology, and also as an expression of the positivist philosophy of Russell and his pupil Ludwig Wittgenstein and the famous, now infamous, Vienna Circle. For those who are concerned with spirituality and issues of whether there is continuity beyond the death and disintegration of the brain, contemplating mind from the perspectives of time and eternity is particularly pertinent, and that's what I'm about to do. The Jung-Pauli notion of unconscious archetypes implies influences independent of space and time. Influences independent of space and time, like those axes in our geometry books at school. And timeless dimensions of mind and of the self. Timeless dimensions of mind and of the self. A dual aspect position on mind rejects neuroreductionism, as in the emerging field of neuropsychoanalysis, with a lot of empirical research by Oliver Turnbull and Mark Soames, while active quantum information bridges mind and matter in the work of David Bohm's contemporary colleagues, I emphasize contemporary colleagues, Harley and Pulkanen, in a paper published, Can Mind Influence Matter Through Active Quantum Information, published in the Mind Matter Journal in 2005. Archetypal symbols indicate an objective order of the cosmos in which humanity is part, but which also transcends humanity. Jungian analysis, therefore, can be construed as a contemplative spiritual practice as well as a form of psychotherapy. So that ego consciousness, finite ego consciousness, experiences a connection between time and eternity, the personal and universal aspects of the psyche. And I've taken that quotation from Murray Stein's book on Jung's treatment of Christianity. Now I come to a quote by a very famous physicist, the Nobel laureate Erwin Schrödinger, author of a book first published in 1944 titled What is Life and Mind and Matter? And contrary to popular opinion, Schrödinger was no materialist, as can perhaps be seen in this quotation. What we in our minds construct cannot have the power to annihilate mind. What we in our minds construct cannot have the power to annihilate mind. And there was another comment very similar in nature, which was to the effect that the arrow of time cannot deal a mortal wound to the mind of its creator. Intimations of immortality or implications for self-continuity, perhaps so. In a letter to his colleague, physicist Marcus Spheres, Pauli states, and I quote, "What I have in mind concerning such a new idea of reality is, in provisional terms, the idea of the reality of the symbol. On the one hand, a symbol is a product of human effort. On the other hand, it indicates, as I have suggested, an objective order of the cosmos in which humans are only part." And this was a matter very close to the heart of Carl Jung. For Jung, symbols represent archetypes which possess their own extra-physical or metaphysical reality. So they're not just signs pointing to something beyond themselves. They have an extra-physical reality in their own right. And David Bohm, like Teilhard de Chardin and Jung, proposed human participation in a greater collective mind capable of going indefinitely beyond the human species as a whole. Such collective mind, of course, is analogous to Jung's view of the unconscious psyche and the archetypes of the collective unconscious. In another quite contemporary, non-reductionist perspective on mind, David Bohm's colleagues Harley and Palkanen have suggested the existence of a mind field, a term used by the Nobel laureate and neuroscientist Sir John Eccles as an emergent property in biological systems which have reached a certain level of organisation and complexity. The mind field, with its mental and physical aspects as complementary to one another, is also situated within a broader context of field theories of consciousness, such as the one currently being worked upon by Sir Roger Penrose at Oxford and Stuart Hameroff, the anaesthetist, who has often asked, where do people go when in states of deep anaesthesia? Harley and Palkanen actually wrote, and I quote them, mind, regarded as taking place at a higher level of organisation, with both a mental aspect and a physical aspect, goes beyond processes studied in traditional neuroscience. Well, of course, that's neroism, but can nevertheless play a role in the physical world, because there is both a mental and a physical aspect. Through its effect, for example, upon exocytosis at the synaptic cleft between neurons, where information is transmitted between neurons via chemical messengers or neurotransmitters, mind is understood as a new level containing active information which affects the quantum potential, which in turn affects physical processes in the brain. So there are three layers there in the work of Harley and Palkanen. Now, the factor beyond the notion of quantum effects triggering neural processes in the brain is that active information contained in Eccles' mind field can in turn affect the quantum potential. Mind can therefore be viewed as a relatively autonomous, though higher level of active information in emergent evolution. This view is quite consistent with those of Pauli, with his U-field and Jungian archetypes, and of course with the view of Teilhard de Chardin, with his concept of the noosphere, which represents a transcendence of biological by a new psychosocial or cultural evolution. And no, that didn't come from Teilhard de Chardin. It came from an eminent evolutionary biologist, Julian Huxley. As the mirror in which the existence of the universe is revealed to itself, consciousness is an emergent evolutionary phenomenon. In humankind, evolution has become not only conscious of itself, but directed, but not before humankind. The evolutionary biologist Julian Huxley glowingly endorsed Teilhard's thought in his introduction to Teilhard's magnum opus, The Phenomenon of Man. Richard Dawkins, incidentally, in his book The God Delusion, totally omits that glowing endorsement of Julian Huxley while referring to Teilhard as deceitful. However, we shall leave that aside for a moment. Huxley actually remarked that human beings have become business managers for cosmic evolution, and that mind-like properties must be present throughout the universe. Extraordinary. Bohm suggested that even the quantum level can be thought to have, via active information, a primitive mind-like quality, although it obviously has no consciousness. So no one had better accuse me of panpsychism. Humankind completing God. This may perhaps be, for some conservative theologians, the most heretical idea of all, because the notion is that God is not external to the cosmos or to human beings, but that human beings are actually completing the evolution of God. And I shall explain why I think that is. Human beings are actors and participants in evolution, natura naturans, creating nature. While the concept of adaptive or directed mutation complements Darwinian natural selection in the experimental work of McFadden and Alcohili, published in Biosystems in 1999, volume 50. I shall have much more to say about their work shortly. Teilhard de Chardin's Evolving Noosphere of Collective Consciousness, about which I wrote a paper in the Journal of the American Teilhard Association, Teilhard Studies, in 2013, suggests that humankind is completing the evolution of God towards a divine focus of mind, or a Christ omega point, introducing finality and purpose to evolution, a reality referred to in a letter by Wolfgang Pauli to Niels Bohr, which I shall be quoting shortly. This notion complements the Jung-Pauli notion of the unconscious archetypes as cosmic ordering and regulating principles. So the idea that humankind is completing God towards a divine focus of mind, introducing finality and purpose to evolution, complements the Jung-Pauli notion of the unconscious archetypes as cosmic ordering and regulating principles. Now, if I may refer to a book by Jungian analyst Michael Fordham, Explorations into the Self, there is a statement which is quite remarkable, which is that the study of the collective unconscious must, and I quote, reveal the nature of God as far as it can be understood by human beings. The numinous self-archetype corresponds to the unconscious God image, or imago Dei, is one of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, about which I should have a lot more to say a little later in the webinar. Now, to return to the extraordinary work of McFadden and Alcohili, McFadden and Alcohili have actually challenged the orthodox neo-Darwinian dogma, I emphasize dogma, that mutations occur only randomly, by experimentally demonstrating, the phenomenon of adaptive mutation of microorganisms through environmental changes, leading to such alarming phenomena as multiple drug resistance to deadly strains of TB and probably also HIV. The claim that McFadden and Alcohili actually made is that living cells could form unique quantum measuring devices that probe the internal quantum processes occurring in their interior. I'll quote them directly from their paper. Living cells could act as biological quantum computers, able to simultaneously explore multiple mutational states in superposition and collapse towards those states which provide the greatest advantage. With regard to the discovery of quantum computing, the Japanese physicist Koichiro Matsuno, in a paper published in 2000, no, we're not going back to the early 20th century, in the year 2000, actually asked the question, who got there first with regard to quantum computing? Biosystems or Richard Feynman? Well, it appears from the experimental evidence that biosystems have beaten both Richard Feynman and humankind, even our best physicists, to the task of completing a quantum computer or engaging in quantum information processing. To take that a step further, the Nobel laureate in physics Erwin Schrödinger, to whom I've already referred, could perhaps be regarded as father to the idea of adaptive mutation in living cells, having made his now very famous statement, "Quantum fluctuations produce mutations." Quantum fluctuations produce mutations in the 1944 edition of his book, What is Life and Mind and Matter? 1944. Extraordinary. Now, this idea is quite revolutionary because it implies an internalist ecological perspective on evolution, with rudimentary mind understood as active quantum information, though of course devoid of emergent consciousness. Now, to turn to Wolfgang Pauli's comment on, somewhat satirical comment on purposiveness. In a letter to Niels Bohr, Pauli wrote, and I quote directly, "In discussions with biologists, I met with difficulties when they apply the concept of natural selection in a rather wide field without being able to estimate the probability of the occurrence in any empirically given time, of just those events which have been important for biological evolution. Treating the empirical timescale of the evolution theoretically as infinity, they have an easy game to avoid the concept of purposiveness, while they pretend to stay in this way completely scientific and rational. I think nothing could be further from the truth. To put the principle here more formally, empirical research entails estimating the probability of events within finite timeframes to actually permit the formulation and testing of predictions derived from theory, and of course preferably in the lifespans of human beings who don't live for infinite time. Pauli also noted that this apparent evasion by neo-Darwinian biologists enabled neo-Darwinian biologists to attribute a virtually miraculous function to chance, as if chance or randomness could have a miraculous function, or indeed any causal efficacy at all in science. This sleight of hand commits denial of any very inconvenient luminous dimension in cosmology, or in an evolution which in and through humanity has become conscious of itself and directed, as Teilhard himself proposed. And finally, at the risk of labouring the point, with regard to purposiveness, the Australian physicist Paul Davies has noted that the 13.7 billion years since the universe began is insufficient time. 13.7 billion years is insufficient time for even a single protein to have emerged by chance, and that from a physicist. Davies was exploring the possibility that the genetic code might need to be complemented by a quantum code in explaining the sheer diversity of life forms, including human beings with their reflective consciousness and acting as business managers in cosmic evolution on planet Earth. We, of course, hold planet Earth in our hands, as I shall be pointing out a little later. We're directly responsible for the future of the planet. The hymn of the universe. Well, I've taken that title from none other than the Jesuit paleontologist and mystic Teilhard de Chardin, from a text written by him probably in one of his more mystical moments. The hymn of the universe. The incarnation of God is characterized by conscious participation in the future of evolution. One, manifesting a mind and cosmic order transcending humanity collectively, and contingent upon a global sense of identification with the species. The global sense of identification with the species, and of course the Earth, requiring a holistic vision, itself mystical, of the interconnectedness of all beings and all life, all ecosystems. This could lead to a spiritual awakening on Earth of a perhaps mystical nature, whereby lost wholeness and sacredness are restored, rather than banished as they tend to be by metaphysical materialism. This restoration of wholeness would of course involve the Jung-Pauli archetype of the conjunctio oppositorum, or union of complementary opposites into a whole, or holism if you prefer. And the complementary opposites include mind and matter, science and religion. I now come to another famous quotation by Erwin Schrödinger. And some of you may find this rather surprising, coming from a Nobel laureate of his caliber in physics. What Schrödinger actually wrote was, physical theory strongly suggests the indestructibility of mind by time. Physical theory strongly suggests the indestructibility of mind by time. Again, intimations of immortality and continuity? Perhaps so, perhaps so. And if so, the hymn of the universe does not have to be a final and mournful requiem with nihilistic dissonances, which would be the case if we continue to follow the path of the militant neo-atheists and their addiction to materialism. With regard to the archetypal symbolic reality with which psyche and physis confront us, as I have already noted, Pauli proposed that Bohr's notion of complementarity would characterize the relationship between mind and matter, science and religion, in a manner analogous to the wave-particle and energy-time dualities already discussed in physics. I'm just restating this here to emphasize what I think is a very, very important point in epistemology. This dual aspect monist understanding of reality eliminates both materialist and idealist forms of reductionism, while avoiding the error of panpsychism, which, as I have said, results from an unconscious or unconscious conflation of extended mind with emergent consciousness. The unus mundus, or one world, of Jung and Pauli is analogous to the implicate order of David Bohm and his colleagues. There's almost parallel processing here, the implicate order and Jung's collective unconscious. And now I come to what is perhaps the most subversive, but certainly the most primary aim of this webinar, which is, as the title of the slide suggests, deconstructing the religion of metaphysical materialism. I see this heresy as a menace to the future of the Earth. Why? Because if we continue to devour the resources of the Earth, including fossil fuels, leading to global warming and depleting the planet of its resources, we're going to end up in a fairly short time in humanity's evolutionary lifespan with a planet that is totally uninhabitable for future generations. That would be sinful. The archetypes transcend the finiteness of individual and collective humanity, so that the eternal is present in a perennial now, that of the unconscious psyche, which is the origin of mathematical insights and empirical laws. I've read a bit of Sir Roger Penrose's work on this, and he gives as an example the famous Dirac equation, which links the relativity and quantum revolutions in physics. Penrose also informs us that Paul Dirac was particularly impressed by the sublime and exquisite beauty of that equation, and that aesthetic considerations may have been important in his selection of it. I'll take Roger Penrose's word for that. Is he was an eminent mathematician and physicist, but how interesting. Sublimely beautiful equation. Unconscious dimensions of mind and of the self are not bound by space and time. Now, as a quick aside, for those who are doubtful of or skeptical concerning the scientific robustness of archetypal psychology, or for that matter, psychoanalysis in its various forms, it is in fact the case, on the basis of solid empirical research now going back many decades, that psychoanalysis does permit robust and useful scientific predictions. I personally, in humility, have had a slight hand in this subversive activity. In 1978, I published a paper in the British Journal of Medical Psychology on unconscious ego defenses and affects, suitably quantified, of course, as predictors of behaviour and outcome in women presenting with symptoms of breast cancer. And much later, as a further example that might appeal to Jungians, I published a paper in the Mind Matter journal titled Unconscious Mental Factors in HIV Infection, where unconscious mental factors were predictors both of immunity and of survival time or mortality. Now, this paper also introduced another notion of complementarity, and that was the idea of the complementarity of psychic and immune defense, both of which are concerned with preserving the integrity and continuity of the organism, one at the level of psyche, the other at the level of the biological immune system. More complementarity. Furthermore, neuropsychoanalysis, as I have already suggested, rejects strict neuroreductionism and materialism. And that's most evident in the work of Oliver Turnbull and Mark Soames and their colleague Gart Panksepp, though there isn't time to go into detail about those papers here. Liberation from materialism means freedom. Freedom to embrace a numinous dimension of evolution and deconstructing the religion of metaphysical materialism. And given what I said a moment ago about its menace to the earth, I think that would be quite a relief for many people who actually love humanity and the world. And this deconstruction would then make possible the hymn of the universe being a final and triumphant Te Deum, not a mournful nihilistic requiem. The existence of evil and suffering has been a scandal, at least for those forms of religion and those theologians who continue to rely upon positing the existence of a benign, anthropomorphic interventionist God external to the universe and totally devoid of shadow qualities, rather than the concept of the numinous implicit in the evolutionary process. Jung treated this problem in such essays as Answer to Job in 1952. Now, having read Jung's collected works, particularly his papers on religion, I think it's possible that Jung had not entirely liberated himself from the patriarchal father god depicted in Scripture, especially the monster in the Old Testament myth, and in his father's Swiss Reformed Church theology. However, Jung did make the comment, or refer to the incarnation as a world-shaking transformation of God. A world-shaking transformation of God. Oh, really? So God is not immutable. A world-shaking transformation of God. God is evolving. According to Richard Dawkins in his secular scripture, The God Delusion, the problem of evil and suffering keeps theologians awake at night. Well, of course, if he's referring to the God of the Old Testament, I'm inclined to agree with him. It's as if God is suffering from a borderline personality disorder. That is the Old Testament God. with his destructive shadow qualities denied, split off, and projected onto Satan and into the world as the mythic fall of humanity depicted in the book of Genesis. Jung actually wrote The Dark Side of God in his essay, Answer to Job, which I mentioned in 1958, and in his treatment of the God archetype in religious mythology. According to Jung, humanity represented in the figure of Job seemed to be morally superior to the God of the Old Testament. Well, of course, what a monster. The God, though, whose evolution and becoming conscious would be expressed in the doctrine of the incarnation of God in Christ. Jung explores such evolutionary developments in his essays Transformation, Symbolism in the Mass, which he referred to as the rite of the individuation process in volume 11 of his collected works, and Christ as a symbol of the self in volume 9, Ion, of the collected works. The evolutionary process of God dispels a myth in which God remains a remote, supernatural, interventionist deus ex machina, rather than representing the transcendence of which humanity is capable. As Fordham expressed it, discovering the supernaturalness of man. The evolutionary theological doctrine of the Incarnation is that God became fully human. Now, with regard to changes in the Imago Dei, Jung actually wrote in Answer to Job, and I quote him here, "The future indwelling of the Holy Ghost in man amounts to a continuing incarnation of God. Christ, as the begotten Son of God and pre-existing mediator, is a firstborn and divine paradigm, which will be followed by further incarnations of the Holy Ghost in the empirical man." Christ was to be understood as a symbol of the numinous self-archetype. So, through ongoing incarnation in humanity, God becomes conscious and is completed by humankind in directed evolution. Like the 14th century mystic Meister Eckhart, Jung believed in a continuing incarnational process rather than a singular historical event, because the incarnation is an integral part of evolution and is continuing as the term divine paradigm implies. Now, I've taken the title of this slide, The Supernaturalness of Humanity, also from Michael Fordham's book, Explorations into the Self. I've actually covered some of the points in the slide, but just quickly, the evolutionary process of God dispels a myth in which God remains the old remote supernatural interventionist deus ex machina, rather than representing the transcendence of which humanity is capable, or as Fordham expressed it, discovering the supernaturalness of man. The evolutionary doctrine of the Incarnation is that God became fully human, so that the corollary in depth psychology terms would be that humanity becomes conscious of the implicate divinity which is both immanent and transcendent. One, wait for it, this is controversial, where there is a transformation of the Trinity into a quaternity, with restoration of an eternal archetypal feminine anima face to the Godhead, which Jung believed was implicit in the 1950 proclamation by Pius XII of the dogma of the Assumption, and that was noted by Jung in Ion, 1951, page 87. This transformation would, of course, facilitate the divinization or resacralization of the world, in which I believe Jung, Pauli, and Teilhard de Chardin were intuitive prophets. The anthropomorphic image of God, which Richard Dawkins attempted to annihilate in his book The God Delusion, had already been rendered superfluous by the physics of Isaac Newton and irrelevant by the evolutionary theory of Charles Darwin. However, the transformations in the God image which I am elucidating expose such neo-atheist positions as vacuous straw-man arguments which have nothing whatsoever to do with contemporary understandings of the numinous in-depth psychology and an incarnational or process theology, perhaps best illustrated by that of Todd de Chardin. The implication, of course, is that at last the 400-year schism between science and religion can indeed be overcome. Transformations in the Imago Dei, or image of God, again implying the evolution of God, is to highlight the point. The transformation from a Trinitarian to a Quaternarian image of God, or Imago Dei, represents a radical paradigm shift in theology. A radical paradigm shift in theology, which mirrors insights from Jungian archetypal psychology and the way symbols develop through the ages. As I have suggested, Jung understood the papal proclamation of the doctrine of the Assumptio Mariae, or Assumption, in 1950, as representing the integration of the archetypal feminine anima principle into the realm of deity, so that wholeness is restored to the Godhead. Extraordinary. So that wholeness is restored to the Godhead. No wonder that Jung called this doctrine the most important religious event since the Reformation. That's in Jung's own work, and it was quoted also by Murray Stein in his 1986 book. This most important religious event would help to overcome the historical split between spirit and matter and the masculine and feminine faces of the numinous self-archetype, which was indistinguishable, according to Jung, from the God image. So that would enable the historical split between spirit and matter and the masculine and feminine faces of the numinous self-archetype to be overcome. Apropos individuation, Jung interpreted this process as the union of finite ego consciousness with the unconscious shadow animus and anima aspect of the transcendent self, which of course is not bound by space and time, the unus mundus, or universal substratum of the personality or psychic structure common to all souls, which would have been known in the Middle Ages, of course, as the anima mundi, or world soul. This transformation, very importantly, this transformation from a trinity to a quaternity could create the rationale for the elevation of women to positions of authority and leadership in ecclesiastical structures such as the Catholic Church, however much such sentiments may tend to evoke censure from the Vatican at this stage in history. The transformation would provide a rationale for elevation of women to roles of leadership in ecclesiastical structures such as the Catholic Church. And I hope I'm one of many voices in the world who are expressing that sentiment. Such evolutionary developments and transformations would suggest that the prognosis for God might be optimistic, rather than the rather pessimistic one of being consigned to a limbo of either an illusion or delusion, as neo-atheists believe. The future of God. The future of God. Is there one? Some of you will have noted in that title, The Future of God, an allusion to a very, very famous work by none other than Sigmund Freud himself, titled The Future of an Illusion, where the illusion, of course, was monotheistic religion and superstition. It was part of Freud's scientific project to actually rid the world of religion and superstition, although he did occasionally have lapses in the form of such statements as, Dreams bring to light material which cannot be located in the forgotten childhood of the patient, but which contain residues of the archaic legacy of humankind or a racial unconscious. Here, Freud, towards the end of his life, I think, is coming very close to Jung and the notion of the collective unconscious. God bless him for having the courage to say so. In Psychology and Religion, Jung wrote, and I quote, "Strictly speaking, the God image does not coincide with the unconscious as such, but with the special content of it, namely the archetype of the self, from which we can no longer distinguish the God image empirically or phenomenologically." His absolute rapturous delight with the doctrine of the Assumption was that it symbolically represented the integration of the archetypal feminine anima with the masculine trinity in traditional Christianity. Now, I'll share with you an anecdote here. It's rumoured that in Sydney's very evangelical diocese, with its patriarchal God image still, there was a certain stained glass window in which the representation of either Mary Magdalene or the Virgin Mary had a beard painted onto it to disguise the fact that the feminine principle was brought into the realm of deity. How's that for misogyny and homophobia? Beard painted into the stained glass window representation of the Mother of God or Mary Magdalene. Remarkable. The image of God as quaternity, in conjunction with the concept of human wholeness, would function in this religious tradition as a master symbol. The image of God as quaternity, in conjunction with the concept of human wholeness, would function in this transformed religious tradition as the master symbol. And I acknowledge my debt to Murray Stein for that particular quotation. This would mean an evolution of God which Jung believed would take about 600 years. Now there I wish to pause for a moment. Jung, as you all know, died in 1961. Todd died, symbolically perhaps, on Easter Sunday in 1955. Since then, there has of course emerged the phenomenon of the global internet, which makes presentations such as this webinar possible. The global internet also permits and facilitates a prodigiously rapid transmission of information around the world, bringing human beings into very close proximity to one another indeed. So given that, I think it might be possible that estimate of 600 years for the evolution of God that Jung referred to might be revised down. Perhaps so, and that is an empirical question. As Murray Stein commented in his book, Jung's Treatment of Christianity, the doctrine and image of God would evolve in a future universal rather than tribal religion. Very important. We're going to have a mysticism or religion which encompasses and connects all people. The danger of tribal religion is that the ideologies can be used to rationalize the acting out of humanity's destructive shadow qualities, aided now with the destructive power, terrifyingly destructive power of thermonuclear weapons. So it's very important that the evolution is towards a universal rather than tribal religion. Murray Stein actually wrote, and I quote him here, "In the transformed religious tradition, as foreseen by Jung, this would be expressed in a symbol that represented God as a quaternity and a unio oppositorum. Just as the Yahweh of Judaism was transformed into the Trinity of traditional Christianity, so also the Christian Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost would become a quaternity in the next stage of religious evolution, or God's individuation. That's with the restoration of the sacred feminine to the Godhead, or to the God archetype. In conclusion, these reflections on mind as active information and archetypes as cosmic ordering and regulating principles not only represent a position radically different from the religion of metaphysical materialism, they also, I believe, refute the argument that God is a delusion proposed by Richard Dawkins and his devoutly religious neo-atheist disciples. God and humanity are in an entangled state, so that the individuation or evolution of both cannot be separated and are absolutely dependent or contingent upon one another for completion. Humanity not only participates in a numinous dimension, but also in co-creative divinization. Co-creative divinization by directing the future of the noosphere and the biosphere, culminating in an omega point or divine focus of mind, or Tao would say a Christ omega point or divine focus of mind, one in which science and religion are integrated and coexist in a relationship of complementarity. This magnificent rose window at the northern end of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris is a sublime example of a cosmic mandala symbol representing the numinous self-archetype as well as a conjunctio and a state of integration and wholeness, not just within individual human beings, but within humanity collectively. As such, it represents the God image as a quaternity in conjunction with the concept of human wholeness. With the continuing incarnation symbolically represented at the very center of the window or mandala. It is perhaps remarkable that this ancient edifice, completed in the year 1250, still awakens feelings of awe and rapture associated with the God archetype, just as it did for the medieval people who once venerated the numinous symbols and presence contained in its temenos, or sacred space. That concludes the formal presentation.
And would you like to tell them a little about the piece that we just heard?
Yes, it was a piece composed in the 16th century, and I thought it rather suitable to combine it with the mandala symbol, the rose window in Notre Dame, just to show how timeless and universal these archetypal symbols actually are. Because I suspect that when people wander into Notre Dame and see that magnificent window and hear this type of music, they can still be brought into connection with the luminous at the level of feeling. Also, I must apologise that I lost my place a couple of times with the slides. I hope that didn't upset things too much.
They did not at all. Everything will turn out fine in the recording. I can go ahead and put those slides where they need to be. It's so much information. It's so complex. I don't know how you kept track of it the whole time.
Thank you.
So, I'd love to start with our first question, which one of our close supporters put in even before the presentation started, so you know that she would really like an answer.
Yes.
She says, On page 66 of The Individuation of God, do you believe that humankind is the species which is most reflective of God's consciousness in the universe? Or is there a possibility of an even higher level of consciousness?
Well, I think there are two parts to that might have an answer to that question. One is that I truly believe, following Teilhard de Chardin and Julian Huxley, that human beings are business managers for the whole process of cosmic evolution, and that consciousness is the mirror in which the universe is revealed to itself in and through us for the very first time, before we get to be business managers of cosmic evolution. And with regard to the second part of the answer to that question, I believe that we are evolving, of course, beyond nationalism, for example, to a global holism and to ever higher states of consciousness, such as would be befitting an evolution existing at the level of mind as well as biologically, which I think we've largely left behind.
It's truly fascinating. Let's see. I have a question from Lynn Cruz. Oh, yes, wonderful. Just one moment. Given the resonance or complementarity between consciousness or mind and the material world, what ideas can you share with us regarding how an individual might hold awareness of unfolding events in the world, specifically as we consider phenomena like environmental destruction, the threat of war in the Middle East, or global warming? How do you understand the way of an individual state of consciousness? Global warming. How do you understand the way an individual state of consciousness interacts with the material world?
I think that is understandable, comprehensible, and intelligible if we drop our conflation of extended mind, either Jung's collective unconscious or Bohm's implicate order, if we drop the conflation with reflective consciousness, because those people, and people like Teilhard de Chardin, write of what's called the within of matter, the interior aspect of matter, and that is all about mind, either as active quantum information, eventually arriving on the evolutionary stage as our individual and collective reflective consciousness. And I think it is through that individual and collective consciousness that we can potentially, both individually and together globally, influence the future of the noosphere on Earth, and, as Teilhard suggested, bring about this gradual resacralization of the world and a divine focus of mind where we have reverence for all life, for all beings, where we acknowledge our destructive shadow qualities but no longer enact them upon each other or upon other nations with thermonuclear weapons or with terrorist attacks. So I think it's a responsibility not just of individuals but of groups and eventually of the species as a whole.
I thoroughly agree. I think that it is in each individual, and for the groups, it's the toughest when you have somebody in charge who is just spreading this hostility. Thank you for that wonderful answer. I have another question here. What could you say about numinous experiences of the divine as induced through use of psychoactive drugs or both indigenous people? Psychoactive drugs for both indigenous people and modern people. Do you feel that this is or could be a viable avenue for engaging in the work of individuating God?
Well, before I come to near-death experiences, of which I've had one, I believe that, as in other cultures, some cultures have used psychoactive drugs like mescaline, for example, as sacramental substances to induce an encounter with the numinous in what we would refer to as the unconscious. So it's an altered state of consciousness which facilitates connection with something numinous or divine within the initiate, in the case of the mescaline and initiation ceremonies. Beyond that, however, deep psychotherapy and meditation can help people get in touch with this numinous dimension, and they have been the object of study as mind-matter anomalies by Harold Appensbacher and his colleagues in Germany. near-death experiences as direct conduits to an experience of something divine or numinous, which many previous atheists would have been very skeptical about before they actually had their near-death experiences. I actually had one myself after very complicated cardiac bypass surgery in 2005, where I was actually clinically dead for about 15 minutes. I was told they had great trouble resuscitating me. And it's on page 58 of the book. I provide a brief description of it. But it was an experience of being surrounded and enveloped by this glorious, non-personified but loving presence and light and rapturous beauty. And that is my sense of what it is to be connected to the unconscious God archetype. Certainly not something I could arrogate to my finite conscious ego, and certainly something I wasn't seeking, but there it was. When I recovered from the, when I was resuscitated, I was able to actually tell a friend about this numinous experience, and I turned to him with all of these pipes hanging out of my body and said, God is so beautiful. God is so beautiful. And of course, I didn't have in mind there the patriarchal father figure beyond the universe, but this wonderful presence and experience of infinite being, which I had experienced in the near-death experience.
It sounds kind of like God right there was using science to keep you alive in order to write your book, in order to do this webinar. That's incredible. 15 minutes, Peter. That's amazing.
I actually said to my friend, after I made the comment, God is so beautiful, I've been given the formula. I now know what I have to do. And that is indeed what led to writing the book and to publishing the paper in the Mind and Matter Journal, which is the journal of the Society for Mind and Matter Research.
Incredible, Peter. Just incredible. When you were talking earlier about the mescaline, it made me think about the American Indian and their use of the peyote. Of course, when they were going on spiritual journeys, I forget what the technical term was, but its use is widespread. Let's see, we've got a couple more questions for the last 10 minutes. Please comment on the West. Seemingly animated by a demonic spirit attempting to reestablish a second east-west split in the world. Can this be placed within the process of the incarnation of God in our time?
I believe that the notion of Meister Eckhart and Jung himself of the continuing incarnational process through history and in evolution is intrinsic to evolution will actually bring about, as the now deceased Benedictine monk B. Griffiths once put it, of a remarriage of East and West. I think the more we understand each other and love each other on the basis of perceiving all human beings, irrespective of differences, as sacred and interconnected, the less likely it is that the West will act upon its shadow qualities, or for that matter, other tribal groupings on the basis of using their religious belief systems as rationalizations for such horrible acting out as occurred, for instance, in 9/11. So I think the incarnation will lead to a marriage, a remarriage of East and West, rather than a splitting.
I see. And do you think that technology as a whole is kind of helping bring that together? The more that the internet spreads, it seems that the more information spreads throughout the tribes, as you say. You know, cell phones and the internet truly are arriving. Is that you said in your presentation that the internet is going to take that 600 years that Jung thought and kind of crunch it down some? Do you think that the spread of information is this reason?
Yes, I do. You see, I think that technology is potentially a two-edged sword. It has, I believe, this incredible potential for bringing about the unity and interconnectedness and sacredness of human beings and a new holism that transcends nationalism. We become creatures of planet Earth, not of particular nations. But the dark or shadow side of that technology is the awesome destructiveness which it can put into the hands of people who are simply despiritualized and who wish to covet the world's resources and plunder them.
They do seem to be able to spread much misinformation. I was talking to someone over today who still thought that China was one of the worst polluters, which they are, but they are not much worse than many other countries, including the U.S. And it's this misinformation that truly is making people think, these lies. It's not true. Where the U.S. is not the green country that everybody hopes it is. China is not this polluted devil. It is the internet and misinformation that is making these thoughts come about.
Yes.
I agree with you.
I think both groups, of course, contain denied and repressed shadow qualities, which can then become the most terrible and violent projections of one onto the other, and that is the stuff of which global warfare could be made. Let's hope we can avoid that as a species by using the technology to promote unanimization, to use a word of Todd, the unanimization of humanity rather than more division and destruction. I mean, if people learn and come out of denial of what we're actually doing to the Earth with global warming and consuming its resources to the point of extinction, eventually even groups like the United Nations will have to become aware of the danger of just unmitigated and continued consumerism. Something has to change there.
Absolutely. I saw today in soap that we use today, the exfoliating soaps, they have these small microplastic beads, and they are going into the drain and going into the lakes. Lake Michigan is one of the big ones where they were having these masses of plastic just from people's shampoo, and we don't realize it. They didn't realize it till it was too late, and now it's an issue. The plastic in the world, it's really getting bad, and nobody knew that it was shampoo that's helping it.
Yes, we have to stop destroying our own ecology.
Agreed. Well, we have one more question, so let's see. Alan Shore of UCLA, in his 2012 book, The Science of the Art of Psychotherapy, says that as a result of advances in neuroimaging, we can now locate the personal unconscious in the right hemisphere of the brain. Do you feel this is another expression of materialism, or is it simply the location of personal consciousness that does not negate the notion of a collective unconscious that is numinous and transcendent?
I think it would only negate the experience of the numinous and the collective unconscious if the era of neuroism or neuroreductionism applies. Now, it's one thing to identify the neural correlates of all sorts of experiences that occur phenomenologically and in consciousness, including those which are most sublime or scientific illuminations. It's quite another to simply naively and simplistically identify or reduce those experiences to what is actually happening in neuroimaging of the brain. Certainly there's a correlative activity, but it would be to be gripped by the spatio-temporal hold of materialism to then make the non sequitur conclusion, really, that what's happening in the brain is the actual experience itself. And in the experiments where Buddhist monks meditating are having fMRI scans done, I don't think anyone is suggesting that the content or phenomenology of their meditation experiences could be deduced from a knowledge of what's on the fMRI scan alone. That would be real reductionism.
I see. Very interesting. Well, Peter, it looks like our time is coming to an end. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
Only that I hope that this webinar will reach quite a number of people, and it will be one of a number of contributions which help facilitate what is my part of my personal reason for still being on this planet, I suspect. I'm 70 in a couple of weeks, and that is working towards, individually and collectively, creating what Todd referred to as a state of global unanimization or one-souledness. I think that's part of my task. One of the difficulties, I think, is that individuals can feel so totally overwhelmed as individuals by the sheer enormity of this task that they give up. And that, I think, is the danger. I think we must all try and work collectively towards these higher ends.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that, especially my generation, late 20s, early 30s, we have a tendency to look at things and just say, hey, what can I do? What could even we do with such small numbers? But it takes a change. It takes that
We
individual
have the
courage.
global internet to work with and lots of knowledge and wisdom from the ages.
Agreed. Well, Peter, it's been a privilege to host this with you tonight. I look forward to having the recording up. Everybody, the recording should be ready latest Monday. I'm going to try to get it out this weekend, though. Peter, once again, thank you so much. I'm sure if we could hear everybody, they would be clapping as well.
Well, I hope there were a few who heard us.
Well, I'll talk to you very soon. You have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
God bless you as well.